CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The UK economy posts 0.1% growth between January to March, with the country hit by strikes, the cost of living crisis and bad weather.
Our other headlines: China will send its peace envoy to Ukraine, Russia and European countries in an effort to try to broker a truce in the conflict.
South African rand slumps to a record low against the dollar after Washington accuses the country of providing weapons to Russia.
Turkey's troubled economy dominates voter concerns on the final day of campaigning ahead of Sunday's elections.
And carbon emissions are still rising in China, but so is clean energy as the country aims to hit its climate targets.
The UK has posted a very slight rise in economic growth for the first quarter of this year.
The country's central bank has predicted Britain will avoid a recession, but the cost of living crisis and rolling industrial action is weighing heavily on productivity, and Britain is lagging behind other major economies.
Our correspondent Paul Barber has been crunching all the numbers. Paul.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. Tepid is probably the word we'd use to describe Britain's economic performance so far this year, and it reflects the rather wet and cold weather we've been having, which has certainly been one of the factors influencing how much money is being spent here. Well, the UK's Office for National Statistics says the economy grew ever so slightly in the first quarter between January and March by 0.1%. Now, reasons for that growth can be put down to the IT and construction sectors. However, if we just focus on March, the economy actually contracted by 0.3%. Food sales fell, as did car sales. Analysts say that the stubbornly high inflation levels, the general cost of living and negative real wage growth are weighing on consumers. And this, in turn, is hitting the services sector, which is central to growth for the UK economy. Well, on Thursday, in its mission to tame inflation, the Bank of England raised its key interest rate from 4.25% to 4.5%, the 12th consecutive rise and the highest level in nearly 15 years. The central bank said UK inflation was expected to stay higher for longer than previously forecast, but it also sounded an optimistic note, saying the UK would avoid a recession, with business confidence improving and wholesale energy prices falling. Now, you can see here that Britain's gross domestic product outperformed Germany's in the first 3 months of the year. Germany was flat, as you can see. Most other major economies, though, expanded faster. The ONS says that the UK's GDP is still 0.5% smaller than pre-pandemic levels. In Q1, the health, education and public administration sectors struggled due to the ongoing strike action by teachers, hospital staff and rail workers. Train employees from 2 unions are walking out again today and over the weekend, causing further disruption for passengers, especially those trying to get to the Eurovision Song Contest up in Liverpool on Saturday. With talks over pay and conditions stalling, football fans may also be affected at the end of the month, when 2 further strike days will coincide with the FA Cup final. Guys.
Paul, thank you for that. Our correspondent Paul Barber. Well, G7 finance leaders meeting in Japan have been discussing the urgent need for the United States to agree on raising its debt ceiling in order to avert a looming default.
The president of the World Bank, David Malpass, warned that stress in the world's biggest economy would be negative for everyone.
It's only been mentioned of the very high importance of getting it done. Clearly, stress in the world's biggest economy would be negative for everyone. So, but there's clear energy from the U.S. to get it done, and that's stated. The repercussions would be bad to not get it done, but I haven't heard anything that indicates that it won't get done. I expect it to get done.
Well, meanwhile, a debt crisis meeting between President Joe Biden and congressional leaders planned for Friday has been postponed. Those talks will now take place early next week as Republicans and Democrats negotiate spending cuts in return for raising the debt ceiling. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. Well, John, how will it all end? What's to be made of all this?
Yeah. Well, when I heard that these talks, which were slated for today, Friday, had been postponed, and I heard that late on Thursday night, at first I feared the worst. The first thing that came to my mind was that one of the senior leadership here had been taken ill or something like that, because there's an awful lot at stake here, as you know, and the deadline is looming on this issue of the ceiling being breached sometime, we're told, around the 1st of June. But it seems now that we're into the middle of Friday here, that all the leaders involved agreed sometime yesterday, Thursday, that they would postpone this meeting. You remember they met earlier this week. There was no progress whatsoever. We were hopeful there might be something on Friday, but it doesn't seem that way, because I think that they've postponed until next week because there has been absolutely zero progress. There's been no forward motion. Now, my understanding is that the talks are continuing. Well, you'd expect that anyway. The talks are definitely continuing behind the scenes. What I can say is that I think that the dynamic has changed a little bit. We're at a situation now where people really are focusing their minds on this one, and they realize that something has to be done. So in that sense, I think something has changed. There's some chatter out there that maybe, just maybe, the Democrats are looking at possible cuts to offer the Republicans. This comes about as the Republicans point out that if Joe Biden's budget for fiscal 23-24 goes through in full, he'll be adding another $20 trillion to the deficit, or more than the deficit, the debt, over the course of the next 10 years. So that's a possibility, a little bit of wiggle room there, maybe. But I'm afraid both sides are also digging in. Kevin McCarthy, who is the de facto leader of the Republicans until Trump gets the nomination, if he gets the nomination, McCarthy is the Speaker of the House, he's saying today that the Democrats want a default more than they want a deal. And Chuck Schumer, who's the senior senator from the state of New York, who is also the majority leader in the Senate, is saying basically the hard right is what he's calling them, the MAGA supporters, put there with Trump's blessing, particularly in the House, that they are holding the country to ransom. So you can see that both sides are very far apart. Finally, we add to the mix Janet Yellen speaking in Japan at the G7 earlier this week, talking about the need to have a different way of doing this so we don't keep coming back to this problem. President Trump in his town hall with CNN 2 days ago saying there was probably a need for a default and that actually would be okay if there was a short default. Republicans pushing back against that. So the point that we're at, Jamie and Robin, is that we are waiting now to see which side will blink first. Which of them, the Republicans or the Democrats, will actually say what they will actually do. And we're not at that point now, and I think, frankly, we won't be next week either. That would be my bet.
John, we mentioned G7 finance leaders in Japan, obviously twitchy about this, but is anyone in the United States worried about what folks overseas think, overseas opinion?
Well, you know, I've told you before on this program, this is a very insular country. You know that. I mean, they only really care about what's going on in the borders of the United States. But they do care about it over on Think Tank Row in Washington, D.C. There's a whole, it's called Massachusetts Avenue, I think, and all the think tanks are there. And so they're very concerned about it. And I know that they're concerned about it at the State Department. And I've just made a list of some of the things that would happen. It's not complete, but the thing is, if there was a default, there would be total turbulence for a while in the economic system of the world. It is said that stocks would go down by about 1/3. There would be a decrease of around $12 trillion in household wealth, it is said. The housing market would be affected. Retirees wouldn't be paid. Military personnel wouldn't be paid. Social services wouldn't be paid. Government offices would close. Parks would close. And to answer your question, overseas, people who've invested in America would not get their bond payments. Some embassies would probably have to close, and that would affect visa issues for people wishing to come here. So that's some of the things that may very well happen. Now, the biggest thing of all, though, is it's just darn embarrassing. The United States is pretty much the only country in the world where the politicians have to raise the limit on the money they've already spent. And, you know, it was a reluctant focus at the G7 in Japan. I think it's ironic the G7 is happening at this time. Hopefully something was said there to somebody to nudge things along a little bit. But most of all, it's just, you know, how is it possible that the biggest economy in the world gets itself into this pickle every couple of years?
John, thanks for that. Our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
For the past 2 years, the United States economy has defied the odds. It crashed when the pandemic struck, but roared back to life. And even when inflation began to spiral out of control in early 2021, the economy continued to thrive.
But there are now signs of something of a slowdown and fears of perhaps worse to come. Our correspondent Owen Fairclough reports.
Thank you.
Running for re-election, the US economy is looking good to President Biden.
Our economic plan is working.
Inflation is now down 30% from what it was this summer. Unemployment rate is at 3.4%, which is the lowest in 50 years.
But economic output, or GDP, for the first quarter of this year decreased by more than half compared to the previous quarter, a tangible sign of trouble for some investors.
We think a recession is imminent.
A recession is coming.
We're going to have rolling recessions.
Consumer spending has remained robust, but now that it's also slowing, some retailers are in trouble. Gap and Banana Republic shutting 350 stores across the US by the end of the year to complete a 3-year closure program. But at least they're still in business. Party City is one of 6 US retailers that went bust in the first 2 months of this year alone.
One of the most high-profile to go bankrupt is Bed Bath & Beyond. It's closing down all 360 stores across the US, including this one outside Washington, D.C. Analysts say it was too slow to embrace online retail and never recovered when it had to shut down stores temporarily during the COVID-19 pandemic.
And yet discount stores are reaping the benefits of consumers now watching their wallets amid persistent high inflation. Dollar Tree has been opening hundreds of new stores and is refurbishing hundreds more. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Rockville, Maryland.
In the last few minutes, Elon Musk has confirmed the identity of Twitter's new CEO. Linda Yasarino will replace him in the role and will take over in about 6 weeks. She was NBC Universal's global head of advertising and just resigned from the company. Tech billionaire Musk will retain a hands-on role at the social media giant.
Tesla has notified Chinese regulators that it will issue software updates to more than 1 million vehicles amid safety concerns over braking. The company describes the update as a recall. It's unclear whether drivers are required or would be eligible to physically return their vehicles. The company says an issue with brakes in some models could increase the risk of a collision.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Imran Khan, Pakistan's former Prime Minister, is freed from custody the day after the Supreme Court ruled his arrest was illegal.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan has been released on bail for 2 weeks.
The Supreme Court ruled that his arrest on corruption charges related to gifts given to him by foreign leaders while in office was unlawful.
The case has fuelled instability in a country already struggling amid an economic crisis. Our correspondent Siobhan McCall reports.
Imran Khan's supporters celebrate as Pakistan's former leader leaves Islamabad's highest court on bail. He says there was no justification for his arrest.
They showed me an arrest warrant for the first time inside jail. It happens in the law of the jungle. The military abducted me. Where were the police? Where is the law? It seems there is martial law declared here.
The former Prime Minister's dramatic arrest on Tuesday ignited nationwide violence, leaving at least 8 people dead, many injured and thousands arrested. Khan and his Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf party say the charges against him are politically motivated. Many of his supporters are angry at the country's military, which he says orchestrated his removal from office last year. The tension threatens Pakistan's already fragile political stability. The country's economic crisis has also deepened after the government blocked internet services, with business owners fearing damage to their stores.
For the past 3 days, markets were closed and our businesses are destroyed. Protesters keep coming and going, so we have to keep closing and opening our shops. The entire loss is to the people.
No one cares for the people. There is so much inflation in Pakistan, and the people are fed up. Politicians are fighting for power while the public suffers.
Khan's party thinks his arrest could be a huge rallying point as he aims to return to power. But current Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif says the country is being pushed towards destruction. Siobhan McCall, CGTN.
Rockets have landed close to Jerusalem for the first time since violence broke out between Israel and Palestinian militants in Gaza on Tuesday. One Israeli man was killed in the attacks. The Israeli military said it killed 2 Palestinian Islamic Jihad commanders in its latest airstrikes. At least 30 Palestinians have now been killed in this latest wave of fighting.
China will send an envoy to visit Ukraine, Russia and other European countries next week to try and broker a solution to the war.
Beijing's special representative for Eurasian affairs, Li Hui, will be the most senior Chinese official to go to Ukraine since the start of the invasion. As well as visiting Kyiv and Moscow, he's expected to hold talks in Poland, France and Germany.
Our correspondent Shelby Wild is in Kyiv. So, Shelby, how significant is this planned visit to Ukraine?
Well, this is significant in regards to diplomacy with this conflict. We've been waiting on this announcement, and today China's foreign ministry said it would be sending its special representative on Eurasian affairs to Ukraine next week in an effort to promote peace talks. Now, a call between the Chinese leader, President Xi Jinping, and President Volodymyr Zelensky last month mentioned that this would happen, but that was the first time those 2 leaders had spoken since this conflict started. And in that phone call, according to Chinese media, President Xi told President Zelensky that, quote, negotiation is the only viable way out, end quote, in regard to ending this conflict. After that phone call, President Zelensky said that it was long and meaningful. Now, we know that the Chinese delegation, after its time in Kyiv, will head to Poland, France, Germany and Russia as President Xi aims to bolster China's image in regards to being a peacemaker in this conflict. And we know that Li Hui, a former Chinese ambassador to Russia, will be leading this delegation to Ukraine. So there's ultimately a lot to be discussed here on the ground next week in Kyiv between these 2 nations.
So some movement on the diplomatic front then. Meanwhile, on the ground, Ukraine says it's recaptured some ground in Bakhmut. What can you tell us about that and this much-anticipated Ukrainian counter-offensive?
So we heard from Ukraine's military this week saying that they were carrying out effective counterattacks in and around the embattled city of Bakhmut in the Donetsk region. We also heard a top Ukrainian military commander saying that this was inflicting huge losses on Russian forces and that in some areas it pushed back Russian troops at least 2 kilometers. Now, Russia's defense ministry today denied this claim by Ukraine and pushed back on that. But really adding to what the Ukrainian military has been saying, we heard the head of the Russian private military group Wagner, led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, stating that this week an entire Russian brigade abandoned its positions in the south of that highly contested city. Meanwhile, Prigozhin has continued to complain about a lack of ammunition for his mercenaries. He has threatened to withdraw them from Bakhmut. He continues to direct his blame at Moscow's military leadership and has gone into numerous rants now against Russia's defense ministry. So it seems like this feud between the Wagner group and Moscow's military leadership is more prominent than ever. And in regards to the counteroffensive with Ukraine, we heard that the United Kingdom is supplying Ukraine with the Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles. This will allow Ukraine the ability to carry out strikes on Russian troops and targets far behind the front lines. There was hesitation from Western allies in regards to supplying Ukraine with these long-range missiles for fear that it could escalate the conflict further or perhaps provoke President Putin. But now the UK is leading the charge with this. And the United Kingdom said that they had received assurances from Ukraine that these long-range missiles would not be used to carry out strikes in mainland Russia and that it would only be used on what they deemed sovereign Ukrainian territory. We know that these missiles have a range of up to 250 kilometers, so it will be crucial for Ukraine as it now starts its counter-offensive in regards to carrying out strikes on Russian targets and troops.
Shelby, thank you very much. Our correspondent Shelby Wilder in Kyiv.
Well, as we've been hearing, China has been calling for a ceasefire and peace talks on the war in Ukraine. Its ambassador to the EU, Fu Song, has been talking to CGTN's correspondent Juliet Mann.
Position has been explained on numerous occasions, so it can be summed up in one word: peace. So we would like to facilitate peace, and for us, what is most important to have the ceasefire as soon as possible, because we want to put a stop to the senseless killing that is happening as we speak. And that is very important. So we know that there are complex reasons for this conflict, and but the differences can only be resolved through peaceful negotiation. It cannot be resolved on the battlefield. That is our firm belief. And that is why China has been talking to both sides, both to Russia and also to Zelensky, President Zelensky of Ukraine. And I'm sure you're aware that President Xi has recently made a phone call. And actually, China is sending a special envoy to try to facilitate peace. And he's going to visit Ukraine and some European capitals and also Russia. And so these are the Chinese efforts to try to facilitate peace, because we firmly believe that whatever differences that may exist between countries, the only viable way to resolve them is through peaceful negotiations. It cannot be through war.
And you can see more of this interview in the agenda with Juliet Mann this weekend here on CGTN.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has spoken to his South African counterpart on the phone to discuss the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin said he repeated an offer to send grain and fertilizer to African countries for free. Meanwhile, Washington says it's confident that weapons and ammunition from South Africa were loaded onto this Russian vessel in December and were then delivered to Russia. The South African government says it did not approve any arms shipment to Russia and is opening an inquiry.
Well, the rand slumped to its weakest level on record against the dollar. The currency sank to 19.51 against the dollar in early trade, down more than 1.6% on its previous low. The rand has been pummeled this week by investor concerns over the country's worst power cuts on record, but experts fear things could worsen amid those United States allegations that South Africa provided ammunition to Russia. Well, let's talk to our correspondent now, Sumitra Naidu, who's in Johannesburg. Sumitra, good to see you. First of all, what's going on with the rand? South African officials say no arms shipment was approved to Russia, so what's the latest?
Yes, Jamie. Well, as you said, the rand recovered some of its losses today after it fell to a new record low of 19.47 against the US dollar. It fell to over 24 rand against the pound. Today, the currency hovered around that 19.20 mark against the greenback, and of course was weaker against the pound, euro. In fact, it's the worst performing emerging market currency at the moment. The concern, though, is that it may remain under pressure and even slump again if the spat with the US continues. South African government officials, as you said, denying any shipment to Russia, but they have also admitted that they don't know why there was a Russian ship docked in Cape Town in December last year. Of course, the allegation is that the arms were sent over on that ship, Lady R, to Russia. So the government has now commissioned an inquiry to look into the matter. What's also concerning is the rhetoric coming from both sides. The US is clearly very upset. US Ambassador to South Africa, Ruben Brigitte, said America has convinced South Africa is not non-aligned in Russia's war with Ukraine. He went further to talk about South Africa's relationship with the US in terms of US aid and AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is very important for South Africa. And he went on to say that South Africa is not very concerned about these things. From South Africa's side, a minister said today, speaking on a local radio station, that South Africa won't be bullied by the US. So some strong statements coming from both sides that could impact this relationship, more especially around trade. This will not be good for the rand going forward, and of course this relationship between the US and South Africa. Jamie?
Sumitra, let's just put this spat aside for a moment and talk about the broader picture. What is the overall economic outlook for South Africa now?
Well, I'm afraid not good at all. The power crisis is crippling industries across the economy. The Reserve Bank of South Africa has already said that load shedding, as we call it here, will shave off 2% of growth this year. South Africa reported negative growth in the first quarter of this year and will most certainly again record negative growth for the second quarter, placing us firmly in a recession. Some economists have warned that it will take years to recover from the damage caused by the power constraints. You have to remember that it's not over as yet, so that impact will be felt even more as the crisis worsens. We also have inflation at 7.1%. Food inflation is higher at 14%. We are currently suffering a cost of living crisis. It's a perfect storm, as some economists are calling it. So I'm afraid a very grim outlook there, Jamie.
Sumitra, good to see you. Thanks for that. Our correspondent, Sumitra Naidu, in Johannesburg.
You can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Turkey stands at a crossroads. The country goes to the polls tomorrow in one of the most significant elections for a generation.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The UK economy posts 0.1% growth between January to March. The country hit by strikes, the cost of living crisis and bad weather.
Our other headlines: China will send its peace envoy to Ukraine, Russia and European countries in an effort to try to broker a truce in the conflict.
And the South African rand slumps to a record low against the dollar after Washington accuses the country of providing weapons to Russia.
Tens of thousands of people have gathered at the United States border hoping to cross from Mexico before the rules change.
An immigration policy known as Title 42 has expired and is being replaced by strict new asylum laws. Record numbers tried to make it across before the midnight deadline. US authorities say they've processed more than 10,000 arrivals at the border each day this week.
Well, under the new measures, migrants won't be allowed in unless they apply online and could face criminal charges if they cross illegally.
Well, our correspondent Benji Haya is in El Paso, which is on the border between the United States and Mexico. So, Benji, this deadline has now passed. What's the situation like now?
Indeed so. It's official. Title 42 is over. That pandemic-era policy that was used by several different administrations by two different administrations, I should say, over several years to expel migrants from the US's southern border. The current state of affairs, well, you can see Mexico just behind me within touching distance. There, 60,000 migrants await entrance to the United States, hoping that these change of rules will benefit them. And the Department of Homeland Security admits it could be a couple of difficult days ahead. But law enforcement personnel here insist that their increased presence means that they have the tools necessary to try to counter any sort of influx. And the messaging from the government has been clear too, that any sort of attempt to enter the country illegally will mean that those individuals will be deported, banished, barred from the country for 5 years and will not be allowed to re-enter. Around El Paso, we've also seen authorities try to clear up streets from migrants that had camped out, and that's a similar story across the border cities along the 2,000-mile frontier between the US and Mexico. And individuals on both sides seeking a better life, well, their future remains in flux.
So Title 42 gone, new stricter rules in place. What will they mean for people hoping to cross?
Well, I mentioned that the US administration is keen to address the fact that illegal migration will be clamped down on. As I mentioned, banishment for 5 years, but there are going to be more legal routes for re-entering. For example, if people can enter via an official port of entry and having been vetted at processing centres across Latin America or having applied via an application, then they may have their asylum granted on the condition that they have first sought refuge in a country they have passed through en route to the US with very few exceptions. It's worth noting, however, that the situation is quite fluid, that whilst there is calm and order on this side for now, the situation may very well change. There are already legal challenges in place to try to halt that transition from Title 42 to Title 8, with many immigrants advocacy groups arguing that the Biden administration's new set of rules is putting asylum seekers in grave danger.
Benji, thank you very much. That's our correspondent Benji Haya in El Paso.
It's the final day of campaigning in Turkey before presidential and parliamentary elections on Sunday. President Erdogan wants another term in office, but he's facing his toughest electoral challenge in 2 decades, with some polls putting his main rival slightly ahead. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Trent Murray in Istanbul. Trent, one of the candidates, Muharrem İnce, has withdrawn from the election. I mean, what impact, if any, is that likely to have?
Yeah, well, that's right, Jamie. I mean, certainly on paper, you would imagine it would have an impact. There were only 4 candidates running for president on that ballot paper. One of them has now pulled out. But actually, when you strip away a lot of the headlines and perhaps the interest in this, you find out he really only had about 2% in terms of the polls. So it's not thought it will have a major impact. It's thought a lot of his voters will travel potentially to both sides, but probably more favouring the opposition candidate, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Certainly, though, given how close this race is, very much going down to the wire, every last vote counts. And we know that is why both of the leaders of both sides have spent much of today campaigning in areas of electoral importance. President Erdogan has spent time here in Istanbul. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu has been in Ankara. very much just trying to hoover up the final votes of people that may still be undecided, because, as you say, the polls show this thing is incredibly tight, either a slight lead for the opposition or a slight lead for the incumbent, and it seems that going into Sunday, they really do believe, both camps, that this thing could be close, and so they're really using these final hours to try and get through to as many people as they can.
Trent, it feels like this election could be a turning point for Turkey. What do you sense the mood is there?
Yeah, it does, and you certainly get that sense when you're here in Istanbul in particular. We've been out a lot today speaking to folks, including over in Kadıköy, over the Bosphorus Strait there, and you are seeing this huge energy and momentum behind both sides, with campaign teams out handing out flyers, meeting people that get off public transport. You know, if you also go down to the earthquake zone, we were down there earlier this week, you'll meet a lot of people who feel like that natural disaster potentially will affect their vote. Some people believe the government responded very well. Others say they're still living in tents and are deeply unhappy. So, look, I think realistically, this thing, as I say, will be very, very close. I think one interesting development that we've seen in the past hour was, for what we believe is the first time in this campaign, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu appeared on stage in what was a bulletproof vest, it would seem, under his suit. Now, what sort of advice led to that decision, we don't know, but it would appear that from the opposition side, potentially the temperature has been raised a little bit. Could that have to do something with the fact that he made that extraordinary broadside against Russia overnight and told them not to interfere in the election? We're not sure, but certainly going into Sunday, it would seem that both camps are increasingly nervous and cautious about how close this will be, and potentially taking security a little bit more seriously.
Trent, thanks for that. Our correspondent Trent Murray in Istanbul.
Turkey's troubled economy has been a dominant issue among voters at this election. The country is still struggling with runaway inflation and a collapsing currency, which has brought about a cost of living crisis for many. The ruling AKP and the opposition have put forward very different plans for tackling the problem.
Well, CGTN's Louise Greenwood has been following the story. Louise.
Well, Jamie, as we've discussed before, the economy has been really centre stage in this election right from the start. We've got Kılıçdaroğlu heading up this six-party alliance, this opposition that's hoping to oust Erdogan at the polls on Sunday. It's promising a wholesale reform of policy if it does get into power, really getting rid of pretty much all of the legislation that's been brought in under the AKP, particularly around the economy and financial matters. And really key in its pledges is going to be giving back independence to the central bank to set interest rates as its own economists and policymakers would see fit. Now, Erdogan, on the other hand, really pledging more of the same if he does get this another 5 years in office, this unprecedented third decade in power. He is standing fast to this belief in a low interest rate environment, lots of liquidity to power exports, and really use Turkey's substantial manufacturing base to bring about increased prosperity for Turkish voters. Now, Erdogan has always claimed that bringing new levels of prosperity to these Anatolian working classes, these conservative people who make up the core of the AKP's electoral base, has been one of his great achievements while in office. So let's look at some figures then. Well, it is true that Turkey has delivered 20 years of consecutive positive growth under the AKP, averaging just over 1%, but there have been substantial spikes in between then. We've seen very big jumps in GDP growth over that time. Now, in terms of inflation, though, what we've also seen as a result of Erdogan's policy has been this very aggressive stance on interest rates. We've seen this spate of interest rate cuts that have put him at odds with central bank governors. We've seen 3 central bank governors quit during his time in office. They've opposed these policies. And this cheap liquidity swishing around in the system has been pretty well disastrous for inflation levels. They've spiked at 85% in October of last year. They've come down now, but they're still well above central banks' targets. And as a result of that, we've seen many households right across the political spectrum in Turkey experiencing many of their life savings wiped out in value. Now, many households, many people struggling with food prices and energy bills, as they are elsewhere in Europe, but they will argue that their circumstances are particular. They've been brought about specifically as a result of economic policy by the AKP. Now, another consequence of this cheap liquidity is the impact that it's had on the value of the lira, the national currency. And we've seen that now almost collapsing completely. It's now worth a fraction of what it was 10 years ago. Analysts warning that unless we see a substantial rise in interest rates, a double-digit rise in interest rates very soon, we could be seeing the lira fall even further. Some Wall Street banks estimating we could be seeing the lira falling to 30 or even 40 or possibly even 50 to the dollar from its own rate at the moment, just under 20. Now, this uncertainty, unsurprisingly, it spooked the markets, caused many international investors to pull out. Some Wall Street banks estimate that overall we could have seen $7 billion removed from Turkish equities over the past decade. Now, that is money that conglomerates, that Turkish firms could have used to invest, to put into long-term growth, which would mean translate into more jobs, higher salaries for people on the street in Turkey, which in itself would have powered the economy to better things. Now, even if the National Alliance under Kılıçdaroğlu is successful in this neck-and-neck poll on Sunday, it's still not altogether clear whether this money, whether this goodwill from international investors will be forthcoming. Everyone warning that it's going to take an awful lot of time to win back the confidence of the international community if they're going to return to a market that everyone agrees has huge potential just on the edge of Europe. And as we say, as we heard from Trent there earlier, Jamie, this weekend, President Erdogan fighting for his political life in a razor-edge poll.
Well, full coverage here on CGTN over the coming days. Louise, thank you very much indeed for that. CGTN's Louise Greenwood.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, we are too green. French President Emmanuel Macron infuriates environmentalists with his call to pause policies.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw. The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew. And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Environmental groups in France are furious after President Macron called for green regulations to be paused to boost economic growth.
Macron said the European Union had already done more than other parts of the world and that green laws were making Europe uncompetitive. The EU is aiming to slash greenhouse emissions by at least 55% by 2030.
Let's take you to Paris and talk to our correspondent, Natalie Malhas. Natalie, environmental groups, I guess understandably, are upset. But what's the wider reaction across France?
There's been quite a mixed review following the comments made by French President Emmanuel Macron. Of course, we're hearing from the environmental experts that say now is too sensitive a time to be putting a pause on some of these regulations. That needs to be done. A lot of these conversations, unfortunately, are still stuck at the negotiating table. More stakeholders and role players need to be drawn in. Some of the early deadlines set for early 2024 are not going to be reached if we are moving at this pace. So now is not the time, we're hearing from environmental groups, to be putting a pause on any legislation, any of these frameworks and regulations when it comes to monitoring and and tracking the environmentally friendly aspect of many of the goods and manufacturing coming out of France particularly, but Europe as a whole. We've also heard from some of the industry bosses who say the ideals and the plans that President Emmanuel Macron has at the moment going forward is perfectly suited for them. They agree that enough has been done by way of securing the ecology and the environmental framework in which industries operate, but now is the time to roll our sleeves back up and get to work, considering the impacts of COVID-19 and also the war playing out in Ukraine. We've heard from Green MPs that say, in fact, the president is completely misguided and that he should be looking at other aspects of trade and industry, not drumming up the profits of industry bosses, but rather focused on the environment and the situation in which workers are having to cut their survival at this time. Emmanuel Macron says this is exactly what both France and Europe needs to revive the economy, to reindustrialize and to build things back up after the devastating impact of both the pandemic and this protracted war playing out in Ukraine.
Natalie, thanks for that. Our correspondent Natalie Malhas in Paris.
China's carbon dioxide emissions are still rising, according to a new report, but the use of clean energy is also expanding, particularly in generating electricity. The country's carbon emissions grew 4% in the first quarter of this year, hitting a record high. The largest contributor to rising emissions was electricity generation, with the use of coal still increasing. Rising production of construction materials and the use of oil products have also contributed to the rise. However, non-fossil fuels are playing a much greater role too, generating more than 50% of the country's electricity for the first time. Among them, solar installations generated 34 gigawatts of power in the first quarter of the year, almost 3 times higher than the same period last year. New wind power sources added 10 gigawatts, 1/3 up from a year ago. China plans to reach a peak in its carbon dioxide emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. The report estimates that the country is on track to meet its 2030 goals for solar and wind generation years ahead of schedule. Well, let's talk now to Laurie Muller-Werter, who's a lead analyst at the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air and the author of this report. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us. So why have China's emissions been so high this quarter?
There's really 3 reasons for that. What you would, of course, expect is that travel, mobility, air travel have rebounded after the end of the zero-COVID policies. Then there has been a string of droughts and low rainfall that has affected hydropower generation, which has then been replaced by power generation from coal. But the largest reason in the first quarter was a major growth in heavy industry output, especially steel and cement, which are connected to construction projects that the government has started to revive the economy. This helps boost GDP in the short term, but it doesn't really align with the aim of consumption-led recovery, which the government is aiming for.
So these emissions are going to go up before they go down. When are they going to go down?
The recovery and rebound from the post-pandemic, in the post-pandemic situation will probably continue for most of this year. The good thing is that China's clean energy growth, wind, solar, nuclear, is reaching the scale where it could plausibly exceed the annual growth in energy demand, which would then mean that fossil fuel consumption would start to fall. This could happen in the next couple of years. The really big question is how fast energy demand grows, and that depends on economic policies above all.
So a big push in low-carbon energy then, but China's also building more coal power plants. What will that do to emissions?
When you add new coal-fired power capacity, one of 2 things can happen. Either you increase power generation from coal, or the utilization, the amount of time that those plants are being used, falls. The government is saying that they want these new plants to act as backup power and adjustment power to complement renewable energy, which would imply that they would operate very limited fraction of the year. Whereas the builders, the owners of the power plant, obviously want to operate them as much as possible. So there's a mismatch of interests here, and the government will have to manage this carefully to reduce the utilization of the coal-fired power plants and ensure that investments in clean energy continue, even if there's a lot of supply of coal-fired power in the market.
Looking at the bigger picture, the world is really chasing different climate goals, isn't it? How important is it for China to be part of the conversation on climate change?
As the world's largest emitter, how fast China's own CO2 emissions can peak and decline is, of course, incredibly important. The government has said that they will peak before 2030, but how long before is really essential. China is, of course, also a major investor in energy projects in other countries, has made the commitment to stop investing in new coal-fired power plants. China can play an incredibly important role in boosting clean energy in other emerging and developing economies by directing investments in that direction and enabling them to develop in a clean way.
Nori Muraverta from the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Well, green transformation is high on the agenda for China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang, who's in Norway, the final stop on his European visits. Norway is leading the shift to electric transport in Europe, and Chinese EV technology is playing a big part. Our correspondent Johannes Pleshberger reports.
Cars, buses and ferries. To reach its ambitious emission goals, Norway is electrifying all means of transportation.
The electric ferry is coming in and it's going to dock here, and the charging tower and the plug will come down, and we'll plug it in the boat, and then the charging will begin. The next step is electrifying the high-speed vessel, which is a little bit more difficult. So we're going to try to use a battery swap system from inspiration from the car industry.
Due to the boat's high speed of 30 knots, charging its large battery would take too much time. So Oslo decided to install the world's first ferry, whose battery is swapped each time the boat docks on port. Inspired by Chinese carmaker NIO's battery swapping stations.
Inspiration from China were critical, especially in an early stage, because we saw from cities like Shenzhen that it was actually possible to actually electrify all buses, all taxis. And that's what we are trying to copy.
Just like Shenzhen, also in Oslo, the entire city bus fleet will be electric by the end of the year. Many of the newly launched EV brands of China, which is currently the world's largest EV maker, have chosen Oslo to be their first stop to the European market due to Norway's 2025 target of zero emissions for all new passenger cars and its tax incentives for EV buyers.
We have a lot of Chinese brands. They are offering very price competitive and very good product. So they have been helping us to boost the whole transition to zero-emission cars.
Although overall Chinese investments have declined by almost a quarter last year, electric transport seems to be becoming Beijing's top priority on the continent. While Chinese battery makers are heavily investing in new European production facilities, the question remains whether Beijing and Brussels will be able to grow closer together through green cooperation. Johannes Pleshberger, CGTN, Oslo.
Europe.cgtn.com has all the week's top stories from China. Here's a quick take of some of them.
There were spectacular views of the polar lights as dazzling beams lit up the sky in Moha. An endangered jellyfish known as the peach blossom, which is believed to have existed for more than 500 million years, has been spotted in Yunnan province. Beautiful jacaranda flowers are attracting a large number of tourists to the city of Kunming. China's most powerful cargo ship has arrived at Tiangong space station, carrying food, fuel and materials for life science projects. A growing number of wild pandas have been caught on camera in Shanxi province. experts say it's a sign of an improving environment. And the summer crop harvest is well underway. More than 30% of winter wheat has already been harvested in the southwest.
There's all that and more at cgtn.com.
When Ukraine won the Eurovision Song Contest last year, few expected it to host this year's event.
Step forward, the runner-up, the UK, and the city of Liverpool, which is now hosting performers and fans for the contest. But organisers are making sure that Ukraine is still in the spotlight.
Our correspondent Julia Chapman reports.
This is a familiar sight in Kyiv, less so in Liverpool. But while the city plays host to Eurovision, it's reminding visitors why the contest came here.
And so he documented this internally displaced people in different parts of Ukraine, in Kyiv and Lviv.
Maxim Gorbatsky is a curator who will soon be moving to Liverpool permanently. He has put together parts of the Eurovision cultural program.
I would want them to be at the same time entertained in a good way, so I want them to be interested in what they see in, but also we wanted to, of course, talk about the war, but we wanted not to talk only about the war. We didn't want Ukraine to be seen only through the lens of, like, it's in the war now. We wanted to show Ukrainian contemporary culture.
That culture can be found all across the city, in everyday spaces where visitors can interact with it. This work takes them inside a train carriage traveling through Ukraine.
People here are grateful that they could see, like, not abstract Ukraine, but very, like, literally Ukraine. And it changes these feelings of, even for, I don't know, be empathic to war, it change because you just can see it here on your own eyes.
It's that kind of experience that transports visitors to Ukraine.
War has never prevented a country from hosting Eurovision before, but all across Liverpool, Ukraine is present in its art, its cuisine, and its people.
Welcome to Liverpool, guys. My name is...
Many Ukrainians are also here for the occasion. 3,000 of them have been allocated tickets to Eurovision. They're being shown the city that's taken up the mantle of hosting on Ukraine's behalf.
Now I see what Liverpool has done. I'm so proud of this city, and I'm not sure any other city would have done the same job because they've gone above and beyond what they were supposed to do. They could have done the absolute minimum and just put up, a few flags saying Ukraine somewhere, and that's it.
In the Eurovision fan zone, an area is dedicated to Ukraine. It provides a very literal taste of the country.
You see our color, blue and yellow. It's very nice and very support us. We're feeling like a home.
While Eurovision couldn't go to Ukraine, Ukraine has come to Eurovision. Julia Chapman, CGTN, Liverpool.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again on Monday, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.